Hey, Adam here, and welcome back. After the previous video of the disappearance of David Horsey and Frederick Hardesty, I thought it might be interesting to see what other disappearances I could find that are centred around remote cabins. To my surprise, and thanks to Crow for letting me know, there is a fairly recent disappearance that to some extent seems quite familiar to David and Frederick's. In October of 2019, 47-year-old Adrian Quintal travelled from her home in Warren to a family cabin in Honor, Michigan. This is a pretty remote cabin, approximately 255 miles northwest of Detroit and 20 miles southwest of Traverse City. Now, something unusual and untoward appeared to have happened to Adrian on the 17th of October at 2:45 am. 7ABC WXYZ News reported this. Around 2:45 am, Adrian called a third party in Warren asking for help, police say. The third party then contacted the sheriff's office. Deputies and Michigan State Police arrived on scene at 2:58 am and saw evidence of possible foul play, but were unable to find Adrian. The sheriff's office and MSP troopers conducted a canine track and ground search of the area with no success. Police say Adrian left behind her personal property, including her vehicle, cell phone and purse. Adrian has not been heard from since the 17th of October. Now, a couple of things there. Firstly, the contents of the call with the third party wasn't disclosed here, so it's not clear at this stage what she was requesting help for. Some articles state that the call was frantic, perhaps indicating fear. Secondly, I'm not sure why she didn't just call the authorities directly if she was fearful or suspicious of something. And lastly, while potential foul play was referenced in the article, the authorities later determined that this isn't the case, but we're not quite there yet. The next article I came across was by Fox 2 Detroit, who provided some more information. A family member said, "We had state police and the dog searching all through that morning. The next day, we had a search party come out. My family and I also did a search as well. We've covered most of the ground and haven't found her yet." Just for some further information, this cabin was owned by the family and Adrienne was doing some work on it at the time. She'd also frequented this cabin since she was a child, so we know for certain that she was familiar with the general area. Initially, Adrienne was with her boyfriend at the cabin, but he came home a couple of days before the phone call. It's also important to note that while the authorities at this point did suspect foul play, one discrepancy was that none of the valuable belongings had been taken from the cabin. Or rather, it's not a discrepancy, but it does highlight that the authorities presumed at this stage that the motive must have been personal rather than financial gain in terms of robbery. What's interesting here is that some of the articles mentioned that because they'd been conducting extensive ground searches all around the area with many people and dogs, that if she was still in the area, then she should have been found by now. So with the evidence of possible foul play and the lack of any findings to indicate what may have happened or where she might have gone, I would imagine that behind the scenes, the authorities were contemplating the idea that perhaps she'd been taken out of the area. It also seems that the search area was extended a bit and they started to scour the swampy areas around the Little Platte Lake and the thick nearby woods too. But as you might imagine, they weren't finding anything, despite the additional dogs brought in and the many drones. I found this quite interesting, basically confirming that the authorities were in fact contemplating that she may no longer have been there. Sheriff Ted Shendell called her boyfriend a subject of interest and have said investigators have talked with him and family. Shendell said no one is in custody or being held in the case. Shendell said authorities conducted an exhaustive search in the immediate area with dogs and an aerial drone but weren't able to locate Adrienne. Shendell said that he didn't know why Adrienne didn't call 911. He said her friend was the last person to hear from her. Shendell said authorities are trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together. He continued, "We don't believe that she's here anymore," adding that other agencies are looking for her downstate. I point this out for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it's interesting that they couldn't locate her phone immediately, probably thinking it was on her person. However, we'll learn otherwise shortly. Secondly, the sheriff said that the boyfriend was a person of interest. However, they couldn't find any evidence to suggest that he had anything to do with it. Now, because he travelled back home 2 days before the phone call, you've got to imagine he must have had a trustworthy alibi while the call was occurring. Of course, it's absolutely possible that one could return in secret, but it seems that the authorities couldn't find anything to indicate that. For instance, GPS data on the phone can't have indicated that it went back, etc. Just things like that. Right, let's learn more about this phone call Adrian made on the night she went missing. A woman who went missing from her family's cabin in northern Michigan in October had phoned a friend the day she disappeared, describing a dramatic exchange of projectiles with 2 men. The friend called police but had given authorities an incorrect address for Adrian's family cabin. By the time police arrived at the right address, some 40 minutes later, they found holes in the cabin's windows and one in the ceiling, but no one inside. During that call, which police said lasted less than 5 minutes, Adrian said that she hit one of the men and the other was returning fire. Police said officers observed multiple holes in the window and ceiling of the cabin, and they searched the area around the cabin for any injured persons or evidence of injured persons. Officers set up a perimeter around the residence and requested additional police officers to the scene. Authorities forced their way inside the cabin but found it empty. I found that detail quite interesting because when you think about the logistics of the situation, at first glance it perhaps suggests that either Adrian had the time to lock the door or it was locked by a third party after the fact. Also of note is the fact that they found the arm that she was using on the ground outside, but they found no evidence of any injuries. There was no evidence that anyone had bled or anything of that nature, indicating that all projectiles had missed. I will note that in the phone call, Adrian believed that she had struck someone. To further compound the confusion, all of the firing had been done from inside the home. I'm sure you can see why I was interested in covering Adrian's disappearance. In some ways, this aspect resembles the disappearance of David Horsey and Frederick Hardesty, where a similar finding was made. I'll leave a link to that now in the top right corner and in the description if you wish to open a new tab. The question then becomes, given that there was no evidence of a third party at the scene, who was she firing at? Another good question might be, why and in what manner did she leave the cabin, drop her arm on the ground and then lock the door? It seems like it might have been a better idea to have stayed inside the cabin, unless of course she thought that these people had managed to make their way inside with her. At first glance, it's an odd situation, and I can see why the authorities were having a tough time trying to piece it together. There's further information on this that I'm going to get into in a moment. First, just before this gets even weirder, here are a couple of interesting quotes from the sheriff and from the family too. "We're very puzzled by this case. I've been doing this for 39 years and there's just a lot of things going on that just doesn't make sense," said Sheriff Ted Chandel. Her sister said it was terrifying. She must have been terrified in order to fire. She heard noises outside and whatever it was frightened her enough to make a phone call to a friend, and that's how it started. Right, now if we haven't already, let's get bizarre. I've spoken about how the arm she was using was found on the ground. Well, her boots and her phone were found on the roof of the cabin. It's difficult to really know where to go with this one, but there are a couple of possibilities. Firstly, I think most will probably be in agreement that this whole situation reeks of a perceived fear, which led to a panic. Did she leave through the door to lock it? She then dropped her arm on the ground, took her boots off and threw them on the roof with her phone? That seems highly unlikely. Or the fact that the door was locked, it's possible, perhaps likely even in that case, that she might have left through another window and climbed onto the roof. Now why she then proceeded to take her boots off on the roof, I've no idea. I'm struggling to paint a picture in my head of what happened and in what order. I can't understand why you'd take your boots off on the roof of the cabin. You could reason that it's easy to drop the phone in a panic, but you can't exactly drop the boots you're wearing. So the question instead turns into, did she or someone else throw them back onto the roof? I can see why someone else might do that to stop a person from moving or getting away very efficiently, so she probably didn't just throw them up there. However, what is perhaps more likely is that it is possible that she wasn't wearing the boots, but from the window managed to throw them up onto the roof where she planned to climb up and put them on. It looks like in that case that she was successful in getting up onto the roof because the phone was found there too, so why didn't she put the boots on? Because she also must have come back down because again, the arm she was carrying was found on the ground outside, and she was nowhere to be found. I'm not sure there's a great interpretation to be had here that makes total sense. As the authorities seem to indicate, it didn't even look like there was a third party at the scene because there was no evidence of anything other than the hulls her arm had discharged through the window and ceiling. Thus, the reasoning looks to have been that it was suspected that she'd then ran into the thick woods, leaving everything behind. Just some other details here. Adrian had a dog at the cabin with her who was locked inside the entire time, completely uninjured, and was discovered upon the arrival of the authorities. At this point in the reporting now, she'd been missing for around 5 weeks, and obviously all searches of the area had failed despite them being extensive and frequent, with the use of thermal imaging technology and dogs. The authorities held several hypotheses at this stage too. That she may have been taken by a third party, or had taken some kind of medication or some other problem that caused her to believe that there was a threat nearby, which then caused her to flee into the woods and then the swamp area. The idea that she was taken looks to have been in jeopardy because, and I quote, "Authorities said that they haven't located any evidence consistent with people being at the cabin, and they checked hospitals to see whether there were any people with wounds consistent with what Adrienne told their friend took place at the cabin." Right, Adrienne's body was found 2 months after she disappeared. Some sources state 800 yards, while most state that her body was found between 300 to 400 yards away from the cabin in a swampy area. All state that she was submerged in about 3 feet of water. That swampy section had been an area of interest for K9 teams searching earlier this month, but it had been almost impossible to reach, police said this week. It was a surprising end, so unexpectedly close to the spot where she disappeared, after such a long, involved search process that had generated much attention. That statement makes you wonder if the dogs had found a scent in the area, though it wasn't specifically stated. Unfortunately, the rules on YouTube feel like they're not completely clear and make it somewhat difficult to explain this next part. In February of 2020, the medical examiner detailed that 2 substances were found in her body. This one, which is on the screen now, and medication that was used to combat anxiety. The examiner also noted that exposure to cold weather was also a factor that contributed to Adrienne passing away. Now, the substance that she took can induce a state of psychosis that is often associated with paranoia, delusions, hallucinations, and unpredictable behaviour. So the rather obvious conclusions for the authorities were that she'd taken this, started to experience paranoia, thought someone was after her, and then ran into the woods, where she then succumbed to the elements. It seems somewhat difficult to argue with the official line of thought given the substances found. I've seen some people who seem to be confused as to why her boots and phone were on the roof, and yeah, that is pretty difficult to understand. But if unpredictable behaviour is a symptom or side effect of taking this particular substance, then I suppose that could account for that, either throwing them up onto the roof or taking them off on the roof. Though when these substances are involved, it's difficult to even really guess what someone might have been thinking, so it's difficult to comment. Though I will say, of course, I don't actually know what happened here, and something completely different could have happened. If you've watched my previous video on David Horsey and Frederick Hardesty, who disappeared in a similar manner, it does raise some obvious implications. I'll link it again now, but just briefly. David and Fred were staying at a cabin near the North Nahanni River in the Northwestern Territories of Canada. They were realised missing around 4 days into their trip. It looked odd because they had discharged their arms all over the place inside the cabin, putting holes in the floor, walls, ceiling, etc. Weeks later, both bodies were found separately in areas that had already been searched, which is potentially what happened here too. Now, the implications in David and Fred's disappearance. Similar to this one, signs of a disturbance were found inside the cabin, and upon discovery the door was locked. I never explored this in the previous video, but that could indicate that they'd both left through a window or separate windows, which would be another explanation for the locked door. In their disappearance, substance abuse was never mentioned and doesn't look to have been found either, but it's not impossible like something like that could have happened. Though in fairness, they were found far sooner than Adrienne, so would you have expected it to still be in the body? I'm not at all familiar with this area, so I don't know. Perhaps it just completely depends on the substance. Though again, to be clear, there was no evidence that they had used any substances at all. In any case, you'll have to share your thoughts with me on this one. I thought it was worth talking about Adrienne's disappearance and briefly relating it back to David and Fred because they do share some similarities. At this point, I came across another disappearance. It's not similar to Adrienne's, but still well worth talking about. Donald Collier was 23 months old and went missing on the 2nd of July 1948 whilst on vacation with his parents in their mountain cottage in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. The same day he disappeared, over 500 policemen, firemen and volunteers landed in the vicinity of Coosa State Park where the search was being conducted. Despite the large searcher presence there, they weren't able to find any indication of Donald's presence, despite having aircraft over the area too. Almost immediately there were some problems. The day afterwards, on the 3rd, wary searchers have temporarily abandoned the search for Donald, who wandered away from his parents' mountain cottage yesterday. The problem was that the area was hit by a heavy storm that day, which made the search effort too dangerous to continue. Donald had disappeared late afternoon on the 2nd of July when his parents visited relatives at a cabin off of Route 31 between Donegal and Somerset. The authorities had believed that Donald had wandered off and lost his way through the wooded foothills of the mountains, and after 5 days of searching, the parents feared that he may have been taken by a third party. The 5th day of searching brought about some hope when a footprint was found in the rain-softened ground about a mile from the Collier cabin. However, after a plaster cast was taken of the print, the state police later determined that it was a deer's hoofprint. It seems as though the authorities had little belief that Donald would be found well, and this belief was solidified when a second rainstorm hit the Somerset area and ultimately postponed the search again. On the 6th of July, 50 to 100 miners from the Pittsburgh Consolidation Coal Company joined the search. So now there was around 600 people searching the area and they never found a single clue. Understandably, people began speculating about a potential bear attack. However, District Attorney Thomas F. Lansbury stated this: "I have talked to forest rangers and game wardens, and they all agree there are no bears in the vicinity." On the 10th of July, Paul Blacker, the grandfather of Donald, recounted the circumstances of Donald's disappearance to the press. It was just after 3 p.m. when they, referring to the party of Mr. and Mrs. Collier, Mrs. Nina Collier and the 2 Collier children arrived here. Mrs. Nina Collier went over to that brown cabin to collect rent. Paul then went on to state that the group had eaten and then returned to the parked car, and this is when Donald had asked his mother if they could go home, and she then left to get him a bottle of milk. While the mother was inside their cabin preparing the milk, Nina Collier, the grandmother, had decided to visit another cabin in the clearing to collect some of their possessions, and she was accompanied by Donald's father and Donald's 4-year-old brother. What looks to have happened is that the mother thought that Donald was with the father, and the father thought that Donald was with the mother. After the mother returned with the milk, it was then realised that Donald was missing. Paul goes on to say, "They then began to hunt and call for him. They walked up the road and into the woods. The father drove up the road. But I think Donnie had enough time to get a good start, and maybe the little fellow went to the right at one of those forks in the road. His father kept to the left. He believed that Donald had followed his father up the road before wandering off in the wrong direction. Being so young, the idea was that he may have been too focused on the road that he hadn't noticed when his father and the other family members had left it. Paul believed that Donald had wandered off to the north of the cabin." The search continued, and on the 15th of July, a spokesperson for the office of Sheriff Carl Hare stated that there were no new developments in regarding to Donald's disappearance. By this point, thousands of volunteers had visited the area, and as you might imagine, rumours were running rampant. One rumour circulated that the parents had been withholding information regarding the disappearance. However, this was quickly discounted when the parents and the grandmother were subjected to a lie detector test. The test was conducted by the Detective Sergeant of Harrisburg, Freeman Raymer. I'm not going to get into the debate of efficacy in regards to the lie detector tests. They obviously are not foolproof, but I suppose this was just a different time. Now, Donald's 4-year-old brother was believed to have been the last known person to have seen Donald before he disappeared, and the police hoped that he may be able to shed some light on what happened. The 4-year-old was questioned, but seemed confused and wasn't able to give any indication as to the direction that Donald had taken. He also stated that he'd been picking wild flowers and had handed them to Donald, who then stomped on them. But this was unfortunately all of the information that they could get from him. After weeks of searching for Donald and no clues being found as to his whereabouts, the sheriff's office began receiving some interesting information from people with, and I quote, "mysterious powers." One gentleman arrived in the Somerset County area claiming that he drove from 50 miles away because he had a dream about a man and a woman fighting over a young person, which led to said young person being hurt. Police said that the dream believer was taken to the cabin where the child was last seen in the Laurel Ridge section and vowed that it was the same scene he saw in the dream. The dream must have ended before the child disappeared, for the man couldn't help any further. A woman arrived in the area also stating that she had a dream about two men displaying negative behaviour towards a young person and then hiding the body under a rock. For several hours, she had volunteer searchers turning over huge boulders. And even when the workers lost faith in her dream, she went away mumbling, "Just wait, you'll find the body under a big rock." Another woman who wasn't from the Somerset County arrived in the area after visiting a fortune teller who had told her that she was appointed to find the child. A state trooper said, "We kinda hoped that she was right, but the climb up the mountain proved too much for her, and after a short search, she lost the appointment." Police also stated that the search had been conducted by several hundred people numerous times but had failed to find a single clue. This was until the night of the 19th of July. Small groups of authorities are continuing to search the area, whilst investigating authorities have turned their attention to a blaze tempt incendiary, which destroyed a small abandoned barn within 3/4 of a mile from where the child was last seen. Sheriff Carl Hare said, "The blaze has a definite connection with the boy's disappearance." Now, the sheriff stated that the blaze had a definite connection with Donald's disappearance. However, this was never mentioned again, so it seems unclear whether there really was a connection at all. It's interesting that he seemed to say that as a matter of fact, and I was never able to find out why. Unfortunately, the situation only gets worse for the Collier family, as on Donald's second birthday, the 21st of July, just 19 days after his disappearance, Donald's father and his uncle Lewis were arrested for stealing a car. The pair admitted to the theft of the auto of Fred C. Schaefer of Somerset. After questioning at the State Police Barracks for several hours in the morning, they were picked up soon after the recovery of the abandoned car on Route 31, near the Westmoreland County line, about 3 miles from the William Rummel cabin where the Colliers have been staying since the disappearance of Donald. Although the pair gave no motive for stealing the car, past police records on Lewis indicated that he had previously been arrested for the same crime. As you might imagine, this was awful timing because predictably, the vast majority of the coverage now wasn't even centred on Donald, but rather on what the father had just done. I'm also sure that the actions of the father probably made the family look pretty bad here. Understandably, the father was arrested for the theft. The father of the lost child has been sentenced by Judge Norman T. Boose in Somerset County Court to serve from 18 months to 3 years in the workhouse for his part in the theft. Collier entered a plea of guilt and was ordered to pay costs and make restitution in the case. There's not really much else that can be said other than that was absolutely terrible timing. There might be an argument to be made that the timing could have been purposeful to shift the coverage of the news. That argument would obviously imply some amount of guilt, which again, there is no evidence in favour of. In any case, at this point it had been 2 months since Donald's disappearance, and no clues had been found at all. The authorities, however, had still not given up the possibility that he was somewhere in the dense underbrush in the hills north of Coosa State Park. How the youngster disappeared so completely, so quickly, has baffled everyone in the area. Some 500 volunteers began a thorough search of the area almost immediately after the disappearance. The search continued in varying intensity for 2 months, but not one clue was ever found. The police had said that they had ruled out the idea that Donald had been taken because the family wasn't wealthy, no contact demanding payment was ever received. I suppose though, that only discounts the motive of profit rather than fully discounting the idea that someone could have taken him. There was some speculation that Donald may never have actually been with the parents. However, this was discounted by Sergeant H.A. Steffens, who had the family take a lie detector test. Again, I'll leave you to judge the efficacy. The third idea was that Donald may have met with animal predation, but Sheriff Hare himself dismissed that idea, stating that the hounds would have led to evidence of that. Almost a year after the disappearance of Donald, on the 2nd of July 1948, there was still no clue as to what had happened, though we did get an unusual update. Authorities wondered today who their brown-haired mystery boy with the name of Don might be. Mrs. Lloyd Collier, who had flown here to see if the child was her son, shook her head. Mrs. Collier saw Don's picture in a newspaper. She thought the features of Don were those of Donald. Today, after holding Don in her arms at Mercy Hospital, she could definitely say that Don wasn't her son. Donald Collier would have been 32 months old now. Juvenile authorities said Don is about that old. He was found wandering on the street last week. He was suffering from malnutrition and a skin disease. That's very weird and a pretty unusual coincidence too, all things considered. This boy called Don was said to be around the same age as Donald, with very similar looking features. Looked to have gone through some ordeal, but the mother didn't believe it was Donald. I couldn't find an update on Don. I was hoping to find some good news, but that seems to have been the last mention of this situation. I sure hope no mistakes have been made there. Anyway, given that was the last update, now seems like a good time to hand it over to you in the comments below. What do you make of Donald's disappearance? And also, what are your thoughts in regards to Adrian and the possible similarities between her disappearance and the disappearance of David Horsey and Frederick Hardesty? I'll link to it again now in case you haven't seen it. Right, with all of that said, I'd just like to thank you for watching, and a special thank you to the patrons who allow me to do this. If you found the video interesting, then please do remember to hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. If not, then feel free to give the video a thumbs down. I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. I hope that you've had a great day, or evening, depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe guys, peace.